very favorite things that are fossilized. One of them is lightning, and the other is raindrops. I don't know if you've ever seen fossil raindrops before, but they're really something else. You have some, probably at Columbia, probably Peter at one point showed you some of this stuff.
It could be.
But what's interesting is fossil raindrops are proof of an ancestral climate that was very dry, arid. Because if it rains a lot, it just washes away. So it's a couple, the driest things are where the fossil raindrops get preserved. Yeah. Anyways, I'll send you some.
Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and to those of you joining us online. Our next panel is organized by Aeon Collective and is entitled A Realist Approach to Carbon Management, Aligning Decarbonization Options with IPCC Findings. This session brings together thought leaders and experts to discuss pragmatic and effective pathways for carbon management, including technologies and policies needed for decarbonization and managing climate change impacts in the medium and long term. Joining us in person is Dr. Julio Friedmann, Senior Research Scholar at the Columbia University. Welcome. Our online panelists are Professor Jos Delbeke, part-time professor at EUI and full-time professor at KU Leuven, Professor Gernot Wagner, Clinical Associate Professor of Environmental Studies and Public Service at the New York University, and Dr. Rob Stowe, Co-Director of Harvard Project on Climate Agreements at Harvard University. I'm delighted to pass you on to our moderators and co-founders of Aeon Collective, Princess Noura bint Turki and Michal Shalin.
Thank you very much, Julio. So we'll try to be as light touch as we can. We know that we have a bunch of experts in their fields, but also old friends, and we'd love to hear them debate and go around the thought process of what we need to do in order to achieve our targets and set goals. It's been more than 6 years since the Paris Agreement has been passed, a lot of talk, very little action that the atmosphere would notice. I'm borrowing a bit of your coined phrase, Professor Gernot. Will the planet notice, right? So the conversations that we're going to try and have today are ones that our atmosphere and therefore our planet will be noticing in terms of positive impacts. And again, I think it would only be fair to start this conversation with Professor Jos Delbeke. He's had a lot of experience in this field, not only on the negotiation front, on the work that he's conducted with the EU, but beyond that on finding pathways of enabling countries that would not have considered the topic of carbon pricing before, perhaps, or the creations of carbon mechanisms or markets. So Professor Delbeke, out of your own experience, how do you see the pathway changing? Now we're at COP26, so there's been 26 of these. How do we see the pathway changing in terms of ambitious action, both in terms of the negotiation side, of course, so things that are revolving around Article 6, but more importantly, on national level ambition, national level action? Are we seeing the needle shifting towards action that is felt on atmospheric levels? Professor Delbeke. And I believe you're on mute.
My apologies. Thank you very much. And it is a real pleasure to be with you today and to discuss those issues. And of course, as I was deeply involved into European policy making, you'll forgive me that I will have a European perspective on the issues. And where I'm pleased is that there has been a lot of talk about strengthening targets. But I do hope that now we move to the other side of the coin, and that is the policies. How are we going to deliver all the promises that were made? And I think that is much more important and also much more difficult. And when I look at the European Union, one of the key elements that has been and will be and is currently so important is carbon pricing. It is not the only instrument. It's part of a mix of instruments. I mean, it's a raft of instruments that currently are being deployed, but without a carbon price, we would not get where we are today. You know, the EU ETS is covering all installations in Europe in the energy and the industry sector, the manufacturing industry. And in fact, today, we have reduced the emissions with 43% compared to 2005. And we have not seen a decline in the output. So we have seen a real decoupling through the incentives that were there. So today we know our targets are playing true, and that means that prices are going up. And prices today in Europe are around 60 euros per ton of carbon dioxide. That's quite significant. Before 2018, we were not hitting the 10 euro kind of level. And these prices are now really working through in the energy mix. And we see some pains, you know, given that gas has become a very pricey energy carrier those days. But still, the carbon price, there is no doubt that the carbon price is going to remain in function, not only for its price, but also increasingly because the revenues are becoming so important. In fact, we raise now every year approximately 50 billion euros that is being used primarily for innovation, for technological innovation, but also to dampen the social impacts that this energy pricing may have on countries. And of course, we would hope that more countries are going to join the club. You know, we have a carbon border adjustment measure on the table. We may discuss that later, but in fact, it is an invitation for others to join. So I stop there, but just to say, good incentives through carbon pricing, our experience with the carbon market delivered. Without that, Europe would not be today where it is.
Do you think, Professor, we're painting a bit of a rosy picture on where things are heading? We've had a bit of a temperature check in terms of these ambitious build back better chants that we've been hearing post-COVID, and we've seen that the impacts in terms of, well, we haven't really built back better everywhere, at least. There are some geographies that have, but others that are still lacking behind. Do you think that's kind of conversation in terms of having a unified, perhaps, price on carbon is a constructive one, or is it one that could be more detrimental in some geographies versus others?
Well, I'm not going to preach that everybody should have the same carbon price. I'm just saying that a carbon price in a policy mix where you have to show ambition is essential. And the carbon price, quite likely for decades to come, is going to be different in different parts of the world. That's well understood. But I think that Europe is making an open invitation for others to also engage in that route, because being alone means that the gap between what is happening in Europe and what is happening in other parts of the world is widening. And that is, of course, becoming a political issue in the rest of the world, but also in Europe itself. You know, 60 euros per ton of carbon dioxide is a level that we did not anticipate at this point in time. We may have expected it for 2030, but you know, we are not yet at 2030. So the price is really significant, and it is creating incentives, but it is also creating pains. There are social impacts because electricity prices, a fifth of the rise in electricity prices can be attributed to the carbon market, and also the pain in terms of carbon leakage. You know, when the price difference is too high, then our companies may leave Europe. And of course, we don't want them to leave Europe. And I think that nobody is aiming for inviting their companies to leave the country. You know, I think that's a general connotation. So we are looking for policies to have innovation, low carbon innovation and low carbon investment coming up. And their incentives are important, but there are limits, and the limits are the social limits and the international trade limits. We have to face up to that reality.
So essentially, we're getting a teaser of framing this carbon border adjustment. We're not going to call it a tax, but a carbon border adjustment as an opportunity, an invitation more than a challenge. And I think perhaps the shifting position of Europe of inviting countries in terms of sharing knowledge, technological capacity building, the know-how. You've had the first ETS, of course, and no one knows that better than you, Professor Delbeke. So I think it gives us a lot of food for thought. Then maybe we might want to jump to you, Dr. Rob. You've done a lot of work in your effort on international negotiations. I think it's not fair to bring everyone to the table, even though both Noor and myself, in terms of the positioning, we think that perhaps we've negotiated enough of what we had to negotiate, and it's more of an opportunity to talk about these bilaterals, about action, tangible action that's happening on the ground beyond the UNFCCC process. But there's a lot of merit, of course, that a process that's maybe a bit difficult to birth, that has everyone in the same room agreeing to similar language, that could facilitate some of the differentiation or could harmonize some of the policies, but also maybe an opportunity to start dialogues around standards, etc. So how are you seeing that space shaping up in the early days of COP26 here, and perhaps a reflection on a bit of the history of where we were, but also where do you see the opportunities being drawn? So Dr. Stowe.
Thanks very much, Michelle. Yeah, you are precisely correct that the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC framework more broadly is the only universal forum in which almost every national government of the world participates. And that gives this forum a great deal of legitimacy. And that legitimacy in turn can be translated into the ability to nudge national governments to do more, as we see, as we've seen leading up to COP26 and as we've seen every day during the COP. Moreover, we have to have such an international forum because of the nature of climate change. We know that climate change is a public goods problem. And this comes down to a very simple scientific fact, which is that CO2 mixes evenly in the atmosphere, and anyone emitting CO2 anywhere causes climate change everywhere. And through a series of logical steps, you can come to the conclusion that you need something like the Paris Agreement. But it's not sufficient, as you were implying. Ultimately, national governments have to formulate and implement policy to reduce emissions and to adapt to climate change. And in many cases, in the emerging economies of the world, they require assistance, so-called means of implementation, finance, technology assistance, capacity and institutional building assistance to do that. So I think what we see at this COP more than in any previously is that the COP, there are negotiations going on, and there are some specific aspects of the Paris Agreement that have to be negotiated, such as Article 6, which pertains to markets. But really, as well, in addition, it's become an excuse to have national governments come forward with net zero pledges, with other sorts of pledges and side agreements that don't directly pertain to the Paris Agreement. So you see these kind of spin-off effects from the international process taking place here in Glasgow more than I've ever seen before. And you can see what Gernot and Jose and Julio, but that's very exciting to me. I think we have made progress in that regard. And we'll see where the rest of the 2-week COP goes.
So maybe if I can dig in a bit deeper, how do you feel these sort of inherited positions over 26 COPs either help bring together progress or perhaps, create more hindrance than assistance in that kind of space?
Rather than seeing these kind of entrenched positions being either a hindrance or a help, the topic of this panel is reality. It's a reality that national interest and domestic pressure, by the way, in many countries is going to be more of a driver than something that happens in intergovernmental forum. So I think we have to recognize that national interest is going to be the main driver ultimately, and use that to our advantage. Over time, demonstrate that it is in the national interest of every country to reduce emissions and often and increasingly adapt to climate change. So we have to use leverage to leverage what may seem like a hindrance, entrenched positions based on national interest, and translate that into an advantage, which is it is in our interest to act boldly on climate change.
If I may jump in, Shahad, please. Thank you very much for your interventions. And I agree, I think you both alluded to this point that we need a mix of different policies and different solutions. And for some countries, certain market mechanisms work. For others that are still developing, they maybe, you know, the political realities are trickier than that, right? They're more challenging than that. And there's this constant push or focus since the earlier days of negotiations that you need to put a price on carbon, but it's also not communicated well enough that carbon pricing can also be implicit, right? And you can use regulations, you can use standards to advance action, to nudge behavior, and the carbon pricing component, that tax or that ETS system could be one element, and it could be $10, it could be 50, it could be 60, and this goes back to the national markets, right? And how they're structured. What is the institutional capacity of a country or a region to actually administer such mechanisms, right? What are their political realities? What are the socioeconomic components that allow or not allow for that to happen? And so I think for me, what we're seeing today is that there's a lot more cooperation on a bilateral level or regional level between nations, and not only in the Nordhaus style of climate clubs, right, where you're putting a price on carbon that's that explicit, but also alliances between nations that are advancing certain technologies, putting in place certain policies to finance certain technologies, to ensure that they are deployed quicker. Obviously, this is a lot lacking because we have only seen this happen over the past, I would say, accelerated maybe 5 years, and recently over the past year. And I think that just highlights the urgency, the understanding of national governments around the urgency to act, and also that we need to find alternative solutions, right? And not focus on what we have tried to do and tried to argue for the past 20, 30 years. And we need to be a little more innovative in a way that's more inclusive. And I think with that, I'd pass to you, Gernot, maybe to speak about climate risks, right? And some of the challenges that we are facing today, and how both policies, traditional policies and novel policies, can spur advancements in technologies that are needed to really address the issue. And then after that, or maybe even bring down the prices of ones that already exist, as you've alluded to in our conversations past. So please, Gernot.
Sure, happy to. So as an economist, so first of all, thank you. Let me start with that. And as an economist, right, I'm obligated to tell you that yes, of course, we ought to price carbon, greenhouse gases in general, right? Now, yes, that can happen explicitly. It can happen implicitly. And this is sort of my two-part answer to your very good question, which is, given how much we know about the quote unquote true cost of carbon, right? Given how much we know that the things we can quantify, and then especially, of course, the known unknowns, how they feed into this social cost of carbon, the cost of how much each ton of CO2 should cost. And given the gap, right? So as fantastic as the European Union emissions trading system is, and it is, full stop, and that we are at 60 euros per ton of CO2 is, like Joost mentioned, right? That what nobody predicted a few years ago is amazing, is an amazing policy achievement. But even there is a substantial gap between where CO2 pricing is at the moment and where it should be. And it's not just for Europe, right? So, Sweden, right? Sweden's carbon tax is 120 euros or so, depending on the exchange rate, right? Twice as high, almost maybe, as the emissions trading system. Again, a great achievement in and of its own, policy-wise. We wished we were there in the US, right? Of course. And we have a ways to go. But there's still a gap. okay, so what to do? Okay, so one step is to say we should shout harder, right? We need to advocate more for explicit carbon pricing. A very important additional complementary step ought to be to say there must be other approaches here. Sectoral pricing, sectoral policies that have high implicit prices, right? And the California low carbon fuel standard comes to mind, right? A $200 per ton of CO2 standard for transport fuels, much stronger than the emissions trading system in California, not as widely coverage, of course, it's just transport fuels, just gasoline for the most part. But still, from an implicit carbon pricing perspective, a much greater level of ambition than carbon pricing alone. And then, yes, right, there's the other side of the ledger. There is the subsidies for the good stuff, right? It's penalizing the bad, taxing the bad, subsidizing the good, and that is valuable independently for all the right reasons, positive externalities on the R&D and research development deployment side, and they all deserve subsidies. But then also, in part, because we can't get the tax in place, because we can't get the explicit price in place. They are not perfect substitutes, right? We still need the carbon price too. But yes, given the political economy, given the difficulty, given the politics, those subsidies are in fact a crucial component of comprehensive climate policy.
Julio, I know you're itching to comment on what we heard.
Yes, indeed I am. Thank you. And glad to join such an extraordinary panel and to join Aon here today. This panel discussion is titled A Realist Perspective. I've worked in government, I've worked in industry, I've worked in academia, I've worked for big and small businesses. So I think I have something of a realist perspective. Let me start with a couple of things. We are farther along than most people realize. We are nowhere close to our climate goals. Those two things are both true. The glass is half full with water and half full of air. That means it's 100% full. And we are putting more into the glass so that we get better out of it. But the idea of net zero was off the table 5 years ago. No one was talking about net zero. Now we are. That, by the way, has shaken up the gumball machine for real. People are nervous about net zero because suddenly there's no place to hide. You got to do all of it and fast. And that is part of where I think I side with Gernot on this. The United States does not have a universal price on carbon, nor do I expect we will anytime soon. However, the 45Q credit that exists today is already a social cost of carbon of $50, legislated. It says the government will give you $50 to not emit. By the way, inshallah, today that legislation will pass and it will be $85 pre-tax with direct pay, which is worth about $100, and $180 for direct air capture, which is about $220 pre-tax direct pay. By the way, the hydrogen production tax credit that is in there is probably worth between $300 and $350 a ton. And the battery provisions are worth about $600 a ton, and the electric vehicle provisions are worth about $12,000 a ton. So that's the way we do things in the United States. We hand out lollipops. It is not the most efficient way to do it, but it is effective. And as a consequence, we're going to see a lot of clean energy going on in the United States. We're also investing in the innovation ecosystem, which is part of what's required here. Because I'll tell you for nothing, you want to be a realist about this? We do not have the human capital we need to deliver the future today. We need way more human beings on the case. A couple of other things, though, that I would add as flavor to this conversation, if I may. One of them is that we're having most of these conversations without talking about tonnage. That's a misalignment. A lot of climate policy is about megawatt hours, or it's about liters of sustainable aviation fuel. It's not actually about tons of carbon. Second, we keep putting carbon in the atmosphere. This gets back to your point, Michelle. Will we notice that we pass a $180 direct air capture incentive? Maybe, but only if we start pulling out millions and millions of tons of carbon dioxide. This brings us to a core sensibility, which I think, shaking up the gumball machine, is finally delivered. We really have to do all of the above. We have to do all of the above. We have to do all of the above. We have to do all of the above within each of those options. We have to go way farther, way faster, way harder than we thought. The time for moral hazard discussions is long past. We have to get off and into an action mindset. If I was one thing that I would want to communicate to this crowd, stop talking about what we should be doing, start talking about what we can be doing. What can we do with the human capital, the money, and the politics we have today?
Absolutely. Then maybe Gernot, you can reflect on, moral hazard. That's like 101 economics, right? A lot of these things are put under that banner. But again, if we're trying to really be truthfully aligning our modalities to tackle a changing climate with the IPCC report, we're saying remove coal-fired power plants. But in the same breath, we know that those particles of aerosols that are being emitted into the atmosphere are already masking temperature increases, right? Are there any things within those spaces of discussions around what is really a moral hazard? Having certain types of conversations or deciding not to, because it's the easier way?
It's a great way to ask this question, because let me just tell you how conflicted I am in answering this question. I literally have a book coming out today with title Geoengineering, the Gamble. Right? And I would much rather not have to talk about it at all whatsoever. Yeah, right. So, okay, so I'm completely with, so this tax credit, right? And yes, hopefully we will pass the Build Back Better plan. Hopefully this credit goes up dramatically, right? It should go much further. Okay, is that an ideal substitute for an emissions trading system, right? EU style. Is it an ideal substitute for a carbon tax? Is it of course not, right? I mean, you don't have to have you don't have to be a purist economist or, theoretical economist to sort of understand that, of course, there are better ways of incentivizing the things we all know are necessary than to, frankly, create incentives for carbon removal and only incentives for carbon removal. And frankly, spend limited public funds in doing so. But yeah, right. I'm completely with you. So of course, it is clear that, yes, we should be talking a lot more what is than what should be. We should be talking
further on that, Gernot. I mean, there's one thing in terms of creating a safer tomorrow for Americans, for Saudis with the net zero commitments. Yep. But what about the Inuits or those who are living at the frontier of this kind of change? What's tomorrow for them, and in terms of a timeline? Like, well,
tomorrow was yesterday, right? I mean, this is sort of the, what are we on? COP26, right? So, the best time to start decarbonizing was, COP0, right? Or Rio Earth Summit, right? Well, we didn't, right? Kyoto came along, 1997. And by the way, sort of, you mentioned moral hazard, right? We had conversations in the 1990s where basically, earnest environmentalists were on the record saying, thou shalt not talk about adapting to climate change because it detracts from the need to cut CO2 emissions, right? No, okay, fast forward 10 years and, environmental groups, right, realized that, of course, we need to talk about the need to adapt, right? Unmitigated climate is bad enough. We need to act. We should have acted a long time ago. And by the way, we can talk about the need for adaptation in a way that does not detract from the need to cut CO2 emissions. Well, fast forward to today. And, again, I'd like to, I am hesitant, just to be clear, but yes, we should be talking about carbon removal, geoengineering, even solar geoengineering, while being painfully aware of this potential moral hazard, and frankly, trying to do everything in our power to turn it into its inverse, using it, as yet another reason to push us to cut CO2 emissions much, much more ambitiously than we currently are.
Definitely. Please, Professor Delbeke, feel free to jump in. I see.
Well, thanks very much. And I just wanted to make a comment that is combining the two last comments that were made. I'm certainly open for the pragmatic approach. What works in Europe may not work elsewhere. What works in the United States may well work out in the United States, not elsewhere. Every country is different. So I'm really in favor of the pragmatic approach. But one element that I wanted to make as an economist is that cost effectiveness, having the cheapest measures delivered first is very important, because we all know how much we have to reduce our emissions. And we all know that if we jump for the most costly solutions first, that there is not going to be wide support for those measures, because there are lots of resistances to those approaches. So what we learned in Europe is that the combination of policies, not just the carbon price, but the carbon price helps to deliver a lot of other approaches in industry, with our consumers, with household owners. They have to insulate their houses. We are not having such a nice climate in the north of Europe compared to where you are in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And so all these elements matter, and there are so many of them, and having a cost-effective approach matters a lot, because there is so much to be done. And that is what a carbon pricing system delivers. Because in Europe, it's not only the carbon market that is there, we have also fuel price taxes at the pump, that are quite significant. And that has delivered very fuel efficient cars over time, and smaller cars than in other places of the world. So what I wanted to say is, yes, fully in favor of pragmatism, but there is also, given the task that needs to be delivered, a very strong place for a cost-effective approach. And that is what carbon pricing delivers, either through taxes or through markets. And the case for subsidies was made, or tax credits or incentives. I'm fully in favor of that, but I would put that in the box of innovation, where, a lot of discovery of new technologies needs to be made. And that is what we do in Europe. That is that the bulk of the revenues from the carbon market is being invested on low carbon innovation. And I think that is a big help for discovery in hard to abate sectors in particular. Think about steel, about chemicals, cement, fertilizer, non-ferrous metals. There is a lot to happen there, and a lot of technologies are developing. Some speculate on hydrogen, some others on carbon capture and storage, some others on renewable energy and electrification. So let the market discover what is the most cost-effective way of delivering those solutions. So that was the point I wanted to make. Thank you, Michelle.
I mean, I've seen you sitting quite, on the edge of your seat, Julio, because I know you want to jump in on this, but maybe cost-effective to whom? I'd love you to reflect on that. But also, could we trust certain decisions that are on a planetary scale to markets to make? For example, issues that are surrounding direct air capture. I don't think it's no longer a question of a good to have. It's more of a must have at this stage. And are there countries, maybe clubs, I know Noura, you've touched on clubs as well, that are better positioned perhaps to take those kinds of risks to really innovate on behalf of the planet?
And I think just to add to your comment, again, what's cost effective is not necessarily what's realistically possible. And I know I mentioned this, but it's the reality. It's not, and I think in terms of the technologies, whether they're renewables, we need to deploy as much as we can. But the costs are already down. You need policies to deploy them maybe further and faster. But we need to focus on alternative ways, right? Alternative method that would expedite the deployment of the necessary technologies that we do need today. And I'll pass it on to you right now to pick up on that.
Thank you. 'Cause I think it's hysterical to claim that we are doing anything cost effective today. That's ridiculous. The Energiewende was $300 a ton when it came out. Chinese industrial policy around solar was not about cost. It was not about being cost effective. It was about dominating an emerging market. Same thing with the 100,000 windmills that they deployed. Same thing with the 100,000 megawatts of solars that they deployed. Those were power plays. They were not about being cost effective. They were about returning something to their countries and their constituencies, and that was very valuable. Same thing, by the way, I might add about carbon capture. Again, it's hysterical to think that Europe is claiming anything about this when they've deployed almost nothing. And it's hysterical because we tried for 20 years to get CO2 retrofits on existing steel mills. And Europeans fought it very hard on a moral hazard basis. And they're still fighting it, even though it's a quarter of the cost of hydrogen retrofits, a quarter of the cost. And so the politics matter quite a lot about this. This is not being driven by economists. It's being driven by labor unions. It's being driven by mothers and fathers. And this gets me to the last point, which is the point you raised. Cost effective for who? For me, the most impressive news that I've seen out of the COP was the $8 billion to South Africa. That was a radical departure from prior practice in which they said, we're going to help you accelerate the decommissioning of your existing coal plants, and we will take an act of generosity in which rich countries will give $8 billion to a country like South Africa to give them more electricity and more energy access, while at the same time actually reducing the tons. That's an excellent model. It is more aligned with something like the Marshall Plan than it is with something like a carbon tax. And we need a whole lot more of that. We need to be thinking about how to balance these north-south redresses, and we have the money and the technology to do so. And we should be thinking rather deliberately about how we can deliver energy access to the nations that need it, deliver adaptation to the nations that need it, deliver CO2 removal as a way to decolonize the atmosphere. It's what a professor at Georgetown, Olufemi Towo, he says we have to decolonize the atmosphere. And I should be paying for my grandmother's emissions as well as my own.
Then maybe I'll dig a bit deeper into all of that, because I think there's something there. We've been skirting around moral hazard and saying, well, we shouldn't be talking about it too much. But at the same time, maybe in some ways we should, right?
Well, one of the problems we have right now, unfortunately.
Sorry to dig in a bit deeper, Julio.
Go ahead.
How can we ensure that if we have choices on our table between reduce, right, which is a big component, we have to maximize that. And between the risk of people having alternatives and saying, well, yeah, now the reduce doesn't matter as much. So
the reason why the moral hazard argument sustains, and we're still talking about it, is because there are people who are acting in a morally hazardous ways. When I see people claim that there's carbon neutral LNG terminals, that's moral hazard personified, right? And so we see this kind of nonsense for real, and so we have to be careful about it. We don't have to imagine there's moral hazard actors out there, we see them, right? But we also have to get away from this question of should we reduce or should we remove? We know we must do both very rapidly and at enormous scale. I try to explain to people with this metaphor, when you lose weight, there's no wrong way to do it. You can go to the gym, you can eat less, you can change your diet. There's lots of ways to lose weight, but you don't say, I'm only going to do one thing. You usually do all of those. If you have to lose 30 pounds in a month, like you work really hard and you go to the gym and you change your diet and you eat less. And that's what we're talking about here. And for different metabolisms and different people, different climates, different social economic circumstances, they must choose different methods to do so. And that's fundamentally what the Paris Agreement is. It's a weight loss agreement. Everybody said, I'm going to raise my hand, I'm going to lose 5 pounds. That was so much better than Kyoto, so much better than Kyoto. And it means that an event like the COP is about peer pressure. And it's working. We got India to say net zero by 2070. That was peer pressure. First and foremost, wow, that was great. And the fact that the commitments we've seen out of nations like Saudi Arabia are remarkable, and in part that is a heightening of ambition that has come from a recognition of our collective task. So I, for one, am in favor of these kinds of things. And again, what can you do, not what should you do?
I mean, we had the architect, arguably, of the Paris Agreement sitting in Noura's seat yesterday, and she was quite pleased in seeing how effective this ratchet mechanism, this sort of almost a self-fulfilling prophecy of countries having to one-up one another in order to be geopolitical winners within that space and not be left in the wake. So I saw you raising your hand, Dr. Rob. So I don't know if you wanted to comment on that.
I've accumulated a number of comments, but I can't make any of them unless I unmute myself. I think a thread that's been running through the conversation is that we need a portfolio approach to addressing climate change. And that, to me, that means across technology policy versus policy that prices carbon either explicitly or implicitly, and across technology policy or within technology policy, across a range of technologies where we push technology in various ways through the lab and out to the market. And then between those two as well. This is, again, we're trying to be realistic here. That's the title of the panel. And we don't know what's going to work for sure. I mean, we have some experience over the last 30, 40 years, but we don't quite know what to work. So we really need to maintain a portfolio approach between policy and pricing policy and technology policy, and then within those two categories as well for quite some time to come. And most importantly, and the Paris Agreement helps with this, we need to stay alert and to be vigilant, to look where our opening, to see where our openings are when those openings occur, openings where we can run through the door, so to speak, and really make a lot of progress quickly. Most of the time, we're just dawdling along, through no fault of our own as a human race, but just because this is a very, very difficult problem, and it's tied in with a lot of other very difficult problems. But every now and then there's an opening, and if we're ready technologically, and if we're ready in terms of policy, we can make a lot of progress at those points.
Rob, maybe you can talk a little more about China's policies and what they've done, in spite of all their difficulties. I think showing examples of what worked and how they worked. Obviously, there are shortcomings, but maybe speaking about that a little more and then building off of that conversation.
It's a very good question, Princess Nora. China is doing a lot and is an example in a way of implementing a portfolio approach. As I think most listeners are well aware, China just formally initiated a nationwide carbon pricing program. It's just focusing on the power sector right now, but it'll be expanded. And this built on almost 10 years of experimentation in a number of provinces. But at the same time, China is doing a lot of work on subsidizing and advancing technological innovation in storage and CCUS to a somewhat lesser extent, but still a fairly significant extent, and other crucial technologies. And of course, is implementing renewables very rapidly. There's a big piece that's missing here that I won't take time to address, which is the grid, the power grid. Maybe we can talk about it later. But in any case, China recognizes that climate change is a problem and is doing quite a bit about it in some of the ways that I outlined just now.
Any reflections on China, Professor Delbeke? I know we've done a lot of work in that space.
Yes, well, I think what Rob just said is very relevant. I think that China is indeed looking at things. Of course, they experience a very rapid economic growth, but they tap all potential that is currently available. And I would say in a bit of a provocative manner is available in a cost-effective way. They are developing the experience on carbon markets that is available worldwide. And they make their own Chinese, variation of that. And I'm sure it works. It will work. It will take some time, but they are determined to make it work, and the delivery is there. You know, they are fine-tuning the benchmarks, the technological benchmarks, etc. If I look at it with European eyes, I think China is going to use the carbon market that they are establishing to gradually phasing out coal, in particular old inefficient power stations. You know, it's always difficult politically to phase them out, but if you make them less economic, then that's a way to go. And that's the way we do it as well in Europe. They are putting a lot of effort in technology. Renewables was pointed out, but also other technologies. They go for high-speed trains and for infrastructure that is, you know, something that is very interesting compared to use planes everywhere. I think that we have to reckon that they are going to come forward with more radical low-carbon technologies, because they really focus on that. We have seen the battery and the electric vehicle. We are all doing our best, you know, to develop our own capabilities. But you know, Asia collectively is far ahead on the battery technology, and I think that's something we have to reckon. So on China, I think we should not underestimate what they are doing. And I would think they are having one problem, that is rapid economic growth and rapid, you know, industrialization and moving people out of the Middle Ages into industrial society, which creates a tremendous pressure on energy demand. And we are seeing the effects of that those days. That gas is scarce because it's being bought massively by Asia and China in particular. But given and taking a longer term perspective, I would side with Rob. You know, they are doing a lot, and we are going to see the effects in a medium term perspective in a much more pronounced manner compared to what we anticipate maybe today.
So as somebody who's had to negotiate with China, I think that we should not underestimate them. As you said, Joe, I completely agree with that. We should also not overestimate them. We've made that mistake before too. I don't think it's a secret that their emissions continue to rise. Demand for coal is going up. Demand for oil is going up. Demand for gas is going up. Demand for cement and steel is going up. And the actions that they have taken for any of those is minute. It is small. They have added a great deal of renewables. They're adding a lot of EVs. They have made real progress on things like high-speed trains and ultra-high voltage transmission lines. And those are absolutely necessary and must be acknowledged and celebrated. Emissions are going up a lot every year and have for decades. And the idea that they will invent a technology as opposed to steal a technology is a controversial statement, as somebody who has had technology stolen. I think ultimately at the end of the day, there is no future for the world and a sustainable climate without strong Chinese action and partnership. I think that is essential. And China's ready for it. There are no climate deniers in the Chinese government. Quite the opposite. They understand the impacts of climate change very well. But actually marshaling the capabilities of China to this task is a collective work, and it has to be born out of not only an acknowledgement of the scars and difficulty of the past, but I think ultimately an acknowledgement of the need to be generous with each other. Everything that I've said is true, but I still want to work with China closely, passionately, intimately. We need to build partnerships with around the world, and sometimes we will compete with them. A border carbon adjustment is not exactly a handshake with China. It's very much saber rattling, but it's also important. It brings them to the table. It gets collective action in the world. A club of nations, like Nordhaus said, particularly around something like steel or chemicals, would be a way to cooperate, and the very opposite of something like a border tariff. And we're going to need those kinds of things too. But I don't overestimate what they're doing or underestimate. And frankly, I don't underestimate how difficult the task is in working together. That will be a long, multi-decadal task, but there's no substitute for it. We're going to have to do it, so we should figure out how to do it carefully, well, and positively.
May I make one
Gernot.
really...
Sure. Go ahead.
Really quick, if I promise not to do this too often, but one thing about China is that for those of us who are not Chinese, is that we tend to look at China as a monolith, and it most certainly is not. It's not a democratic federal system like Germany is, but it is not monolithic. The provinces each have their own sets of interests and bureaucracies. The state-owned enterprises, including those in the power sector, have their own interests and massive bureaucracies. And the fact that China has made any progress at all amidst all of this is amazing. Just trying to, even for China, and I won't say any more, we know what I mean, it's very difficult to bring such a diverse and complicated and complex set of institutions together to move in the same direction.
100%. Completely agree.
I mean, we spoke a lot about China, but what about, if we're to meet our global targets, we can't leave India in the wake. We can't leave Brazil in the wake. We can't leave Vietnam with their pipelines of coal-fired power plants weeks ahead of the announcement of their ambitious goals and targets almost being greenlit. So those are not things that will be, put on the side now that they've committed. These are things that are going to come into the pipeline. And these are the spaces in which we're trying to have these kind of difficult conversations. So Gernot, do you want to reflect on that?
I think.
Sure, but Jos had his hand open.
Oh, go ahead, yes.
Oh, well,
Okay, well, just a quick comment. I fully agree to what was said on China. We should not overestimate about them. We should not underestimate them, but we have to work with them. I think I fully subscribe that. And if a carbon club idea could work out with them, I think if there was to be a carbon club, US, EU, China, I think that would change the conversation on climate action and on moral hazard, tremendously in the world and in the negotiations that are currently going on in Glasgow. So I think we all should take a very realistic view about them and drag them in a debate and force them to do more. The side comment I would like to make about their rapid growth in their emissions, which is indeed worrying. I'm not going to downplay that. But when we look at emissions per head, the Chinese emissions are at the level of the EU's emissions per head. And they are still the powerhouse of the world. Let's face it, they are exporting lots of industrial products. The emissions per head in the United States are twice as high as the European and the Chinese ones. And I think we have also to value that in the discussion when we are dealing with China, because these are the facts. And I think that is what we need to negotiate and talk about when we would go for a kind of carbon club idea. And the Europeans have made it clear that they are not attached that much to the carbon border adjustment. If that would turn into a carbon club idea, I think many Europeans would welcome that. But we are not yet there. And also the Europeans want to put pressure on the rest of the world to develop a kind of carbon club idea. So that is a debate that we could have. And the idea was raised on explicit or implicit carbon pricing. I think we should dig that out. The difficulty is with implicit carbon pricing, that it is all about estimates, where there is nothing that real. We can have estimates about the carbon cost related to innovation X or Y, but these are estimates, while a carbon market is a very real and tangible thing that allows for comparisons. That's the only thing I want to make. If we could have a carbon club idea, dig out the argument on implicit and explicit carbon pricing, I think many Europeans are ready to engage in that debate, but we should do it fast because the political pressure and the high carbon price is there. And if we are not seeing tangible results in a couple of years, I think that the pressure will be such that the CBAM is going to go ahead. And the carbon club idea would be a missed opportunity. Thanks.
Gernot, over to you.
Actually, frankly, I'm still contemplating the Julio's weight loss analogy, which actually, to be fair, I've heard it before, but I've never really tried to think through what it actually means, right? So,
but may I just very briefly? So, conservation and efficiency is eating less.
Yep.
Right. Changing your diet is renewables and clean energy of various kinds.
Yep.
Carbon management is actually going to the gym.
And here's sort of, right, and the whole moral hazard inverse and all of this, right? So it turns out for some of us, when we go to the gym, the first reaction is, whoa, I'm really hungry and tired, and I am going to stuff myself with whatever I can find, right? And,
right.
Turns out that's how you, bulk up. And as you can tell, right, here's my physique. Let me show it off a little bit more. But you're not going to lose any weight, right? And by the way, weightlifters, professional weightlifters have massive BMIs, right? Body mass indexes, right? Arnold Schwarzenegger, just to pick one who happens to have the same combination of passports here. Let me show them off right here.
That's my second favorite Austrian.
Exactly, right? Austro-American, right? He came across the pond with a few more steroids in his suitcase than I did, right? But yes, right? So there are lots and lots of ways to bring this, of course, right? And the whole point is there are positive feedback mechanisms that we need to get to, right? Invoke, right? And of course, right, there's a reason why there are dietitians and there are experts in how to do certain things, right? You want to bulk up in one way and lose weight in another dimension. Well, there are certain things that work better, that are cost effective to do. And then when you use the money saved and invested wisely, you're doing the right thing while there is a danger, right? While there's a danger to fall off the wagon and so on and so forth. Right. Okay. Not to make too much of your fantastic analogy, but I think we ought to think much more in these portfolio dimensions, right? In the complementary and basically invoking the sort of thing I think all agree and know is necessary. While yes, we also can, frankly, we can point to the op-ed that Newt Gingrich wrote when we were, right, last time around in the US, right, at the height of the Obama era, Waxman-Markey emissions trading system policy push. Newt Gingrich, the then former Speaker of the House, wrote an op-ed, a very prominent one, where he basically said, and I'm only loosely paraphrasing, we don't have to worry about any of this, vote against the bill because solar geoengineering will solve it all. Right? So no, we are not making these things up, right? And he's not some random person. He's the former Speaker of the House who made what he thought was an eloquent, maybe not earnest, but argument for precisely this point of view. So no, we can't dismiss it either. It's out there, it's prominent, it's going to only become more prominent. On the other hand, no, we shouldn't give up on weight loss entirely just because we know some person who went to the gym and gained weight in all the wrong
So maybe the question then to you, Julio, would be, how do you ensure that you're draining a bathtub while the tap is still running full blast?
Excellent question. Thank you. But before I answer that quickly, Gernot, in this weight loss analogy, solar radiation management is gastric bypass surgery, which is
which, by the way, sometimes is needed, right? For certain patients, it's exactly the right thing to do. And no, the 15-year-old should never, ever contemplate it, right? It's for the 70-year-old or the 50-year-old, right?
And it is also the case that I'm really glad that they researched it before they did it. So we should get some solar radiation management research going so we can figure out how to not kill the host while we do this. And in terms of draining the bathtub, we've all lived now with the bathtub analogy for a long time. And we all know that you have to drain the bathtub, you have to shut off the spigot and you need to pull the plug. And that's the way you drain a bathtub. There's no mystery to this. One of the things that drives me crazy is if we stopped emitting today, we still have 2.2 trillion tons in the air and oceans that we've emitted, right? And that's not exactly a just and verdant world. Like, one of my beefs with Bill McKibben and 350.org is they don't have a plan for 350. We're at 420. How are we going to get there, right? And we also know that we cannot put all of that carbon back on the surface of the earth. We must rebuild forests. We must replenish soils. We have to do that as part, but we cannot get 2 trillion tons back into those systems. We have to do geospheric return, and we have to engineer systems that do the job. So I'm sorry to be a fountain of metaphors today, but this is how I'm wired. Apologies to everybody. In the 1930s, there was a remarkable invention that went around the world, and I'm not talking about carbon capture technology, which was also developed in the 30s. I'm talking about the vacuum cleaner. The vacuum cleaner was a radical innovation. Before the 1930s, the way people cleaned their rugs was they dragged them outside and hit it with sticks. That was a bad technology. The vacuum cleaner is much better. Nobody said that costs money. That takes energy. They said, finally, I can clean my rugs. Right? And the same thing with sewers, which were a great invention. And it's like and same thing with air filters. There's all of these things that we do that help make the world better, even though they cost money, even though they're not exactly cost effective, they do a job that needs being done. The United States government spent a huge amount of money on Superfund cleanups, not because it was cost effective, but because we couldn't leave toxic waste lying around everywhere. It was bad, right? At some point, we have to get into the business of CO2 removal at a very large scale. And the IPCC's most recent report says to hit net zero by 2050, we must remove 200 billion tons of carbon dioxide from the air and oceans. That is not switching light bulbs. That is a Goliath new industry, twice the size of the oil and gas industry, that does not make a product, that just delivers an environmental service. And that's necessary arithmetic. It's necessary arithmetic because right now we only know how to solve 80% of the problem. We know how to get from 51 billion tons to 10. And then we don't have ideas after that. And maybe we'll innovate some more and get that down to 5. We got to do the job. And frankly, that's a way to decolonize the atmosphere. That is a way to provide north-south redress. That is a way to pay for the sins of the past. And we should do that in a way that is proactive and fast. And if we were careful about it, we could actually use those investments to actually create wealth in the global south as well. Places like Kenya and Rajasthan and Ethiopia are great places to do CO2 removal. Places like Indonesia are great places to do CO2 removal. And we should be thinking about that every much as we think about how to create new financial mechanisms or policy measures or green hydrogen or any other thing we think about. It's just part of the work. So we should think about a way to do it that is cost effective, like Joe said, a way that is generous, a way that is fast.
Julio, just to build on what you just said, there's a lot of misinformation out there. And I think if you leave the experts room, right, people still believe that carbon capture is not safe. Sequestration is not proven, or sequestration is not safe geologically. And that's not true. We've already achieved a high level of technology readiness. The world, I would say, an industry has been injecting CO2 for decades. And I'd like you to just touch on that a little bit and then talk about the challenges, which is more an economic component and a financial component, and really need to deploy the right finances for that. And then I'd like to turn to the rest of the panelists to comment on that from an economic point of view and think about, okay, what are, in this world that we live in, where there's so much dissonance in terms of information and preferences, how can we realistically address this, or from a policy perspective?
Happy to. So I'm not just another pretty face. I'm an expert on carbon capture and sequestration. The first technology was fielded in 1938. The reason you can put CO2 into beer is because of that technology. The first carbon capture injection was done in 1972. We've been injecting CO2 underground for 50 years safely without incident. And we have been doing it for climate since 1996. So we've had 25 years of effective action. We now have 27 plants operating around the world. They capture 40 million tons a year of CO2. They have stored it without incident. We have a cumulative storage of 400 million tons, and we have another 65 plants that are in the various processes of development. So there's a lot of good news about this. And again, I've had to help people understand how much we know about this technology, how safe it is, and also how cost effective this is. So we've done lots of analysis, and by no means am I alone, or the IEA alone, or the Global CCS Institute alone. There's been 20 years of very, very good study about this. In point of fact, we know that carbon capture and storage is much cheaper than solar in many markets. It is much cheaper than nuclear in many markets. It's just much cheaper in those markets. Not everywhere. I live in California. It's not cheaper in California. It will be more expensive in California, right? But the challenge is not that it costs too much. If we cut the cost by 50%, we still wouldn't deploy it. The reason why it's not deployed is because it's not financeable. That is entirely a policy decision. So by analogy, in California, we had a 25% renewable portfolio standard for many years. Didn't matter what the cost was. People would have to put the renewables on the grid. Excellent, except carbon capture and storage was excluded by law. So was nuclear, so was large hydro. Those were legislative decisions. Not technical decisions, not economic decisions, those were policy decisions. On a 100% clean electricity standard, which California now has, it is not yet clear if carbon capture is accepted as a compliance mechanism with that. I expect it will be. Governor Newsom has seemed to signal that that is likely to be the outcome, but until that is codified, we don't know. In contrast, in the low carbon fuel standard in California, it is a compliance mechanism. And of course, people have begun to do carbon capture and storage plants because they can now get paid. That only started in 2018. One of the things I want to leave with, and I'm going to close to go back to the others, I really want to hear your points and comments. People know what a windmill is. People know what a solar panel is. People know what a nuclear plant is. They know what a gas turbine is. People don't know what this is because we haven't really done much of it. I'm very enthusiastic about our history, but you don't walk down the street and see a carbon capture plant. And so until this is deployed, this story is going to be with us. We will only be able to change it with deployment. When we have the net zero cluster in Humber and Rotterdam, when we have 100 carbon capture projects around the world, people will then say, oh, that's what you meant. I didn't understand. But until that time, people are going to doubt. And it's because they don't go to the store and buy 100,000 tons of concrete. They just don't do that. They don't walk past carbon capture facilities on their way to work like they do with solar panels and windmills now. They need to be able to understand what we're talking about and understand how it reduces pollution, how it reduces emissions, how it is cost effective. That narrative is still emerging. And one of the things that I find most vexing is the number of people who fight against that narrative when they know better, when they have facts in their hands and still claim the opposite.
So I'd welcome comments from our panelists. How would you address this challenge? Go ahead.
Just very quickly. So I am in fact in Europe right now. Unfortunately, I'm not physically with you. I'm in one of these two places with these other passports. I am in a country that in 1978 voted to not turn on a nuclear power plant that had basically been built, completed essentially. And then there was a national referendum and that plant got killed, got never turned on, and is now a physics research lab, and then an important one, and so on and so forth. So I'm in Austria, and no, there is no nuclear power here, domestically, homegrown, and frankly, it's not a debate in this country. It's just a given, right? We don't do nuclear power. Okay, fine, right? Now, a couple of things. It turns out Austria has a lot of mountains. It also has one big river, outsized for the small country. 62% of the electricity in this country comes from hydroelectric energy, right? So there's a long history here. And yes, there's a lot of luck to be able to have done what Austria has done, frankly, without anything else other than hydro. And yes, now a lot of wind and a lot of sun, but starting, of course, like everyone else at zero, right? Okay, that's one thing. Now, the second thing, of course, is that there is very much electricity being used in this country that comes from nuclear power plants. So of course, right? They turn out to be right across the board, literally, right? There is one that's closer to Vienna now than there would otherwise be at the local plant been in operation, right? Now, it's across the border. There is no oversight from the Austrian Nuclear Regulatory Agency, which of course no longer needs to exist because we don't have nuclear power plants, and so on and so forth, right? Now, okay, I'm not as masterful at colorful analogies as Julio, so I won't pretend, but I think there's something here that has something to do with weight loss, right? We lopped off some part of our body, which is now being used for some sort of medical research, and that's amazing. And it's making great advances for, you know, beaming atoms and so on, and that's all happening, and it's great. But, right, there's something missing. And no, I'm not advocating for nuclear energy in Austria right now. No, I'm advocating for massive investments in nuclear energy in general, for that matter. But it's just yet another example of, right, the small nuclear reactors that we are all talking about that may or may not do something about the pipeline of coal plants in some country that shall remain unnamed right now. Well, that won't happen unless somebody somewhere does make the very, very hard political decisions. And, you know, yes, right, Germany's nuclear exit, while not exiting coal at the same time, of course, increased emissions. Now, for political reasons, maybe some very good political reasons, but still, it was a deliberate step, and we are facing the consequences on the climate front. I'm not saying any of this is easy. I'm glad I'm not a politician. Glad I'm, you know, just an academic talking about it. But that's sort of the point, right? That is the whole point. Let me stop there and hand it over to Julio with his weight loss analogy. But sorry, Jos.
Back to Joe. Joe's next.
Okay, well, CCS is something that is going to happen one way or the other. So I'm a believer into that. But what is the politics? Why is the politics related to it so difficult? In my experience, it is because, as you rightly said, Julio, it's only for climate purposes that you are doing this effort and you are developing an investing into it. The thing about renewable energy, and it was very expensive in the beginning, as you rightly pointed out, the thing about renewable energy was that it was not only good for the climate, but it also produced energy, electricity. And in particular in Europe, that is not having plenty energy resources. So that idea, the combination of the energy interest with the climate interest facilitated a lot the debate and the financing, even if it was very expensive on this technology. And I expect something similar to happen on the electric vehicle. Someone who has been driving an electric vehicle is surprised how pleasant the vehicle is. It's not noisy, you know, it's very easy to drive, it's very comfortable. And I think that that is the reason why we see that some technologies are taking off easier, and there is a willingness to pay that is easier compared to other technologies. And brings me to the question on CCS and geoengineering in general, things that you are only doing for the climate, who is going to pay for it? And that, I think, is a critical question that is very difficult in a democratic society where you have to explain why you are undertaking a legislative action. Because after all, the difficulty with climate change is that it is for the future generations. It's not the people who are bearing the costs now that are seeing the benefits. And that difficulty is all the time present in any climate legislation that is on the table. And I see Gernot, you know, wanting to react.
Just a very quick reaction. And you know, back to what Julio said before, but in some sense, right, it's better to add than to subtract. It's easier to add than to subtract. And no, it's not an easy political decision to spend massive amounts of money, but well, sometimes we see that it is a fairly easy political decision to spend massive amounts of money and do so quickly, right? So no, it's not easy. Yes, cost effectiveness matters, should matter, and so on and so forth, but sometimes we happily spend hundreds of billions of dollars on a whim on stuff that gets added and maybe here might be yet another one of these instances where we do have the political momentum in some countries, not everywhere, to do just that. Spend money just to do something about climate.
So first of all, I very much agree with what Joe just said, actually. And it's, I think, stark in terms of where we are at and what it means. The number one challenge to this question is not what should we do. We have plenty of scientists. We have plenty of Einsteins. We don't have a lot of Roosevelts. That's the challenge that we're facing now. Too many Einsteins, not enough Roosevelts. And the question really is who pays? That's the hard question. And there's only three sources of money in the world, only three: ratepayers, taxpayers, shareholders. That's it. And there's not enough shareholder money. So it's going to end up being ratepayers and taxpayers are the people who pay for this. And we will get some shareholder money, but there's not $130 trillion of shareholder money. Like, this is just not going to happen, right? And so, how to make it work is actually very, very vexing. And this allows me to circle back to Mashael's question about India, about Southeast Asia. Who pays? And Minister Gopal has been very clear, they're not. They're not going to pay for it. They want carbon headroom, and it's reasonable for them to ask for such a thing. So if we want India to go faster, who pays is the question, not what to do. Can we deploy more solar there? Yeah, they're already doing a lot of that. Can we do more with biomass in India? Certainly, way more, way faster, way better. But they have a number one industry in India is railroads. Number two industry is coal. Number one thing the railroad ship is coal. That is not a simple transition. Who's going to pay for carbon capture in India? Will they even let us? India has a very strong anti-colonial sensibility with good reason. My first conversation with India about carbon capture was 2006, and they immediately pushed back and said, no one is going to tell us how to manage our resources. Okay, well, guess what? They're building a huge amount of refining and steel production and cement production in India. Who's going to pay? What are they going to do? These are not simple questions. So A, we're going to do some carbon management. Where's the human capital? Where's the money to do that? How do we get them on board? It's a tactical question, not a strategic question. We know that's got to happen. So how do we do it? How do we listen carefully, acknowledge the challenge, identify opportunities for partnership? That's a good thing to do. The human capital piece is part of that. Second, since we're going to fail at some of that, we'll have more CO2 removal to do. Because we're going to keep emitting for a while. Excellent. So what do we do for that? Is there an opportunity for carbon management, whether it's in mangroves or soil carbon restoration or direct air capture, where India can be a leader and can create wealth and create a stable habitat and sustainable world in a way that makes sense to them? We're just now starting to ask these questions. We've never asked them before. And we have to be humble about how hard this is going to be. But I'm glad that we're asking these questions now, because it allows us to reimagine a future in which there's greater participation and greater equity, as well as greater ambition.
Thank you. I agree with that. And just to check, does anyone have a comment? Sorry, for our panelists.
I do, but go ahead.
Well, I'll let you make your point. We would value your opinions and thoughts, but I just wanted to move the conversation a little bit more on the financing component. And this was a discussion we were having yesterday, right? Even when we're talking about sustainable finance right now, there's still a focus on even if the term is clean is used, where there's a huge focus on renewables alone, and that's great, right? But how can we change that discussion to be more inclusive? And I wanted to get your point, your thoughts on this, Professor Delbeke, because we've discussed this a lot in the past. And how can we ensure that taxonomy is aligned with these inclusive approaches to financing that would really, governments can be creative, companies have to be innovative, but without that policy component, without that, I would say, understanding that sustainable finance has to be more inclusive, we're just going to be stuck in the same loop and same challenge and having these debates over and over again without seeing much progress. And I'll turn to you, Professor Rob, and then maybe Professor Delbeke to hear your comments.
I'm sorry, I'm first.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. Let me add a fourth source of money to Julio's list, and that is those who pay insurance premiums. I think this is a little pie in the sky, but I think there's an opportunity over the coming decades to really develop global risk markets for climate change impacts that by definition incorporate assessment of risk into the financing and therefore accurately price inherently widely varying impacts across the world, in particular between tropical and usually developing countries and those in non-tropical areas that are usually richer countries. The large reinsurance companies are already, they don't call it this, but they're already working on this. And I think you know that the large reinsurance companies have massive research teams, not necessarily in terms of number of people, but in terms of the money they're putting into it and the computing power. So, you know, I think that, again, if we're looking at realistic approaches, this is not quite realistic, so maybe it doesn't quite belong on this panel. But I do think this is something to think about as we move forward and try to provide finance to developing countries, in particular in innovative ways, is to take a risk/insurance perspective on it. By the way, this is not my idea, but I've developed it on the basis of others. Gernot would be able to address it better than I do. Thanks.
You want to reflect on that, Gernot? And then we can go back to Professor Delbeke on the issue of risk and how to account for risk.
So, I mean, the short answer is yes, right? The longer one is that there is a lot more risk than just insurance risk, right? There is sort of broader financial risks and so on, where it's not, right? You're not literally buying insurance. You're insuring yourself in other ways. Now, Julio should respond to this, but in some sense, that still comes back to the shareholders footing the bill, right? Now, of course, the big difference is sometimes the insurance is mandated by law, right? The financial reserve requirement is mandated by the regulator, right, by law. So I think, again, Julio is the master of analogies here, so I'll let him clean up my mess here now. But at the end of the day, the big distinction is, right, is it legislated? Is there, right, the taxpayer who has to pay? Is it regulated? Is it the ratepayer who has to pay? And maybe sometimes insurance falls into that category too. And then the third is it the voluntary private actor? That's the shareholder, right? Sometimes it's the law that mandates the shareholder to do something. But either way, right, it's government saying thou shalt versus it's a voluntary private sector, corporate, financial, whatever approach that, right, is simply done because it's the profitable thing to do.
Finance, Professor Delbeke.
Yes, well, where are we going to find the money? I would like to bring back the carbon market, because that would be a source of money. And that's basically what we try to do in Europe, because now that the prices are reasonable and relatively high, lots of revenues are there. And what Europe is doing is to discover new technologies, or to bring down the costs of new technologies that we know. Carbon capture and storage will be part of that. Geoengineering could be part of that. So using the revenues to crack those technologies or bring down the costs related to these technologies down. I see that the voluntary carbon market has a lot of interest in nature-based solutions, in removals, in forests and things. So there is a lot of discovery going on. And who is paying for that? Well, it's partly the end consumer. It's partly companies. We are all paying for that through a carbon market. If the carbon price is a horizontal one throughout the economy. That's the concept of the economists. Of course, the European carbon market is not covering yet everybody, you know, that's the plan for the future. But that is, you know, the difficulty and the charm of a carbon market. And all the other regulations are indirect ways of approaching the same objective through other more sectoral, more ad hoc, more specific measures. But I would say there is a law in taxation, so to speak, that is you can have a small tax. If it is implemented to everybody, then you raise a lot of revenue. But if you have a focus on only one or the other, which is a subset of those who could be taxed, then for the same kind of revenue, you have to tax them much higher. So, you know, that's something we have to mull over. We have to think over, but I would not exclude from the categories that Julio was making, you know, the carbon market, and that's a little bit the dream of many economists. I'm not going to say, you know, we are going to reach there, but the dream of many economists to have a global carbon price, exactly for the reasons that we have been discussing. Thank you.
So if I may quickly, to Gernot's point, if I were to be glib, I would say that an insurance market like you've described is basically either shareholders or ratepayers or taxpayers that ends up being the same thing. But that would be, I think, missing the point. And this gets back to a point that both Dr. Delbeke made and Dr. Stowe. We need to be innovative on all these fronts. We talk a lot about technology innovation. Trust me, I'm a scientist and innovator. Like, I'm very enthusiastic about that. We are not spending anywhere near enough money or time and energy into that, either as the US or collectively as a world. But we need every bit as much innovation in business model. We need every bit as much innovation in policy. We need every bit as much innovation in regulation. And we have to try all of these things. Dr. Delbeke made the point that one of the benefits that China brings to the world is they innovate in this space. And they try stuff. And they're like, well, that didn't work. Let's try something else, you know? That the provinces do that. And the United States do that. Small nations like Iceland do that, and the United Arab Emirates and the kingdom here. There's in fact, that those other kinds of innovations are every bit as essential to success here, because let's be honest, we don't really know what it's going to take. We all got very good ideas, but you know, I saw a terrible, biting, delicious cartoon a couple of days ago, and it was the devil driving somebody to hell. And he was in the car and he said, apologies for the bumpy road. We've had a shortage of good intentions lately, which I thought was fantastic. That's also part of the work. We not only have to be innovative, but we really do have to be generous. We have to be generous with each other's ideas. We have to be generous with each other's experiences and world. We have to be generous with each other's needs. And then we also have to be generous with the money. There's just no way that we're going to get there without this. And if we can raise money for real in a carbon market and distribute it equitably, awesome. If we can't, we got to try something else, because we have negative time. The best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. We missed that window. The second best time is now. We just got to try stuff. We got to throw spaghetti on the wall. We got to be humble about how hard this is, but we have to be every bit as committed to innovation and generosity as we are to everything else.
I couldn't agree more. So sorry, we got caught up in our brilliant conversation. We didn't really get a chance to see if there were any questions before I wrap up. So I'm gonna go once, twice. Natalia, no? Okay. So maybe I'll wrap up with this. I think going back to the title of what we're discussing is there's the word realist. There's also the word alignment with the IPCC findings. But there's also a third, maybe hidden factor, which is these commitments to net zero. So we have to be humble, knowing that those pathways will look different. There was one major disagreement I have with you, Professor Delbeke. We do not have pleasant climate in the kingdom. This is not a problem of the future. We've already experienced, while the world is waiting for an average of 2 degrees, we've already experienced an average, and one of our PhD students can speak to the point here, of 2.5 increase in our region. And that's not little, right? That's not little when we're seeing the impacts that that's having in Mecca. That's not little when we're seeing the impacts that it's having on potential rainfall, right? We're already feeling it. This is not a problem of the future. It's the problem of today. It's from that spirit that we're aiming to garner more and more of these types of conversations that does not pit us against you. And it's more of a conversation around the we's. How could we together move forward in a way that's credible, that's measurable, And to wrap up with another quote from you, Gernot, I think you've had that one right. One that the planet will notice. Thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you for the brilliant participation in this panel. And hopefully this will be the beginning of many conversations that actually leads, more importantly, beyond the conversation to tangible, concrete, measurable action on the ground and ambition. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gernot, and thank you, Rob and Professor Delbeke.
Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you as well.
Okay.
It was a
Yeah,
pleasure.
It was a real exciting discussion. Thank you.
Yeah.